All right, welcome, Record Live family. It's great to have you back. As you can see, I'm in the office today. It's been a little while, but this week, where many of us, are transitioning back into the office, and it's really good to be in the office and see some colleagues that I haven't seen for a little while. Um, we're joined today by Ryan Stanton, and it's great to see you, Ryan. I'm not seeing you in the flesh in the office. You're still at home today, but hopefully we'll see you next week.
Yeah. I'm a minute's drive away, but I'm not. I'm not quite there yet.
Not quite there.
Close, but so far. Yeah.
So, for those of you that don't know, Ryan has been contracting with us for probably over a year on
I think it's
Signs of the
coming up on a
Times.
year at the end of February.
I think, yeah,
Yeah.
must be close. So, Ryan's been mainly writing for Signs of the Times for us, and also doing a lot of our web optimizing content, which has been really great to see growth in that space over the past year. But Ryan, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're studying your PhD. You have sort of interest in media and some of these things, and it's going to really help with our conversation today, I feel. So, yeah, can you just give us a brief intro on sort of what you're up to when you're not doing science stuff?
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student at the University of Sydney. I'm studying podcasts about games specifically,
Mm-hmm.
because games and podcasts are two big growing media industries, and it's interesting to analyze them. As a result, like I have a lot of love of media more generally, and like analysis of media, both like fiction, obviously the stories we tell, why we tell them, things like that, but also nonfiction, the way news is spun, and the way that what is reported, what isn't reported, the ideas of objectivity and not in that, which I don't think is going to be the focus so much today.
Right.
But I have
But you
interest in a wide variety of media.
but you did do is it journalism that you did before your PhD, or as part of your sort of
Yeah. So I did a media and
credentials?
communications degree,
Right.
which covers a lot. That there was like 3 or 4 different sort of journalism subjects in there that gave you the basics,
Yeah.
but there was also a little bit of audio production, which is where I was like, hey, yeah, podcasting really good, and video
Okay.
production, where I was like, this is a lot. I am not envious of the people that do this,
Yep.
sort of thing. Technically, I'm an English major, but the degree is sort of one where the media and
Okay.
communications part is the major in and of itself, but the English major part is sort of where a lot of like critical analysis and analysis of texts and stuff comes from, because a lot of
Yeah.
what that was looking at that. One of my favorite subjects that I did for the English degree was one called I think it was just called literature and cinema, and it was like, here
Okay.
are books, here are adaptations of books as movies.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
what's the difference between the two mediums? What's the difference between formats? Like, why does this work in this medium and why does this work in that medium?
Right.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I dabbled in English. I did a minor in English when I was doing my communication degree. Mine was a specialization, so I took as many writing subjects as I could. But the English was kind of fun, I guess, to have on
Mm.
the side for, as you say, the textual analysis and the literature, um, different comparative literature that we did in that space. So yeah, that's very cool. And look, I think it's going to lead into our conversation today. Um, I guess the idea of literacy in media may be sort of a foreign term to some people. It may be a bit academic. They may think, what does that sort of mean? Why is it important? Why are we talking about it today? So, I guess that could be a broad subhead of what we're talking about today is media literacy, and why should we as Christians even care about media literacy is, I guess, the question we're going to try and answer today. Now, perhaps slightly before my generation, or I have heard it, but not necessarily said to me, is this urban myth that your angel will wait outside the cinema if you go to the movies. It will be not accompanying you. This is your guardian angel. will not be accompanying you into the cinema when you travel in there to watch a movie. And I guess there has been perhaps a, if you look at it, Adventists or Christians in general, but particularly Adventists have some of this ingrained into our history. There's sort of two responses to media, to pop culture, to movies, to fiction, to literature. It's run for the hills, get away from it, completely ignore it, and avoid it at all costs. Only ever read anything that is the Bible or Ellen White. And then there's another school of thought that's just like, it's not really a salvation issue. Um, it's it's not really a spiritual issue. You can just consume what you like in that space. Those would be, I'd see, the two extremes of the spectrum. And hopefully today we can discover some discernment, some middle ground in terms of this topic that we're talking about. But just give us, in your own words, Ryan, what sort of does media literacy mean? Why is it important?
Well, like it's pretty simple. Literacy, media literacy does kind of sound like an academic term, and I've actually had a conversation with a friend once where, you know, they basically said, like, why do you even use that term? Like, it seems so useless. The concept is so simple, which is basically literacy, literate. Like, remember in primary school and whatnot, when you had literacy as the subject, which was just reading and understanding and comprehending. Media literacy is understanding all the aspects of media, what it's trying to say, how it's trying to say it, why it's trying to say it, you know, both in terms of explicit things of, I understood the plot of that movie, and sort of implicit things of, oh, the plot was a metaphor for X, or, oh, the plot was a metaphor for Y. You know, it's just sort of grasping at the core of media, and that can take multiple levels of complexity and depth. Yeah, I would probably say the deeper the better. Like, it's good to foster a media literacy that is beyond just character A did this, character B said that. I liked when this character made a joke, but that varies. Who knows?
So why is it so important, I guess, is the second part of my question. What's the point of being up to speed with some of this? Why can't we just watch or read or listen to? You talked about podcasts. You know, why can't we just consume media without having to analyze it or understand it or just enjoy it for the surface enjoyment that it might bring us, the escapism or whatnot? What's the point of being a bit more literate in media?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I do think that there is a time and a place for being able to just sort of not have to engage with everything. Sometimes that's fine. If you're doing a lot of work and you come home from a busy day, I hear you. We were talking earlier, and you were telling me you woke up at 4 a.m. Right? I'm assuming when you're heading home, you're not going to want to be sitting down. And if you decide to watch something or engage with some media, you're not going to want to be there, trying to deal with the plot of Inception or whatever, or something which, is mind bending and requires you to think. If you were to do that, I have to assume you'd probably be like, a classic comedy or something you like. So firstly, I would say that, like, you don't need to necessarily do that. But I think it's important because it comes back to the idea that it is not my idea, but one that I ascribe to, and that many others ascribe to, that stories are how we make sense of the world. And this is something which I actually wrote an article for Science, which was about a comic that sort of told the tale of a part of Jesus's life. And it was a point that emphasized that Jesus knew and understood. And that's why he told stories of parables. These stories that represented key themes, ideas, and issues that he wanted to bring to the masses and speak to the masses. And, stories hold power, stories hold sway. They're how we make sense of everything. Even, I would struggle to think of an example of something at any event that occurs in life, no matter how big or small, that we do not convey to others through story, even if that story is as mundane as I went to the supermarket to get milk. They had milk. I bought milk. I came home. That's like beginning, middle, end of a story.
Right. We've got some comments already here. Someone a bit cheeky thinks that you and I both need to visit the barber at some point, I imagine, with the lockdowns, that there's a bit of a resemblance. I think I'm not sure we're related in any way, Ryan, but it would be an honor, I'm sure. And we had a good comment from Len here, who said he was of the generation who were told the angel stopped and waited for you at the cinema door. It is still a belief of many Adventists. And so I guess that sort of concept has led to, in some ways, a wholesale rejection of anything that is fiction or entertainment or culture. Just on picking up the point that you mentioned with, the idea of, I guess, story conveying things, story bringing meaning and purpose. If I look at my career where I am now, right, as an editor of a magazine, that would never have happened if I hadn't grown a love of stories as a kid, reading whatever I could get my hands on, escapism books, more factual books like textbooks, or not textbooks, but like animal books, the picture books with animal facts and stuff like that.
The
that
little
sort of
DK
stuff.
readers. I read a lot of them when I was younger, right?
That sort of stuff, I'm thinking of missionary stories. One of my favorite Sabbath afternoon pastimes was that Mum would buy a lot of Christian biographies, Christian heroes, Christian faith heroes who lived amazing stories. They lived amazing lives for God. And I guess it teaches you things like conviction and sacrifice and all of these big themes. And I guess, we take bigger meaning than what the story contains necessarily, and we find that coming true in our own lives. I looked up this quote of C.S. Lewis. Actually, a colleague shared it with me today in preparation for this conversation. The value of the myth is that it takes all the things we know and restores to them the rich significance which has been hidden by the veil of familiarity. Just get your thoughts on that, like a reflection on how that relates to what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's an interesting quote. That's a good. Sorry, that is a nice quote. I like that one. I think sort of to go back to the idea of to recount the story of like my youth and the stories I had in the youth. I will admit that like I was not one of the people who was part of the generation of the angel stopped at the door, but I was one of a generation that was very much concerned with the discernment in what we choose and to interact with. And I will admit that some of the things that people discerned were bad, I nowadays would disagree with. But I still think that idea of discernment is impossible. Is important in how we choose to and decide to interact with things, because I think we live in a culture that to go back to the idea of turning your brain off, right? Like, yes, well, I just did admit that sometimes that's all you want to do, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes we should be. We live in a culture that sort of tries to encourage us to do that and just sort of promote like a consumerist behavior, both in terms of like the things we buy and stuff, but also in terms of the media we enjoy, sort of more than we probably should. And this is something that like I've written a few articles for Science about some of the deeper ideas in the Marvel films, for example. And I'm a comics fan. I enjoy the comics. I enjoy the films, but like, I would also be one of the first to acknowledge that they are very much like if you were to say it's the same story told like 30 different times at this point, very lacking in substance, very lacking in like actual substantive depth that we can talk about and discuss. Like, I can't really entirely disagree. Like, it is a product made by one of the biggest entertainment industries of all time, like, that almost feels like it's been designed by an AI to just hit the little buttons in your brain that go, oh, I remember that. Oh, that's cool. Like, and not actually have you think or challenge you or engage you in deeper sort of ideas, right? And I think that challenging part is an interesting and key part of the idea, because growth is important for us, right? As people, as human beings, and also as Christians, right? Like, our journey should not be static. But if we are never challenging ourselves and we're never pushing ourselves in directions that, look, admittedly might be uncomfortable, or admittedly might challenge some of what our original beliefs are and force us to reassess them, where we're never changing, we're never evolving, and we're never going to reach anybody. And that isn't to say that challenging requires us to ultimately tear down everything we know and replace it. Sometimes challenging will forge a belief stronger. You'll have the doubts and whatnot. But like, I think part of that in society and understanding how we might be challenged and deal with challenges in society is to understand what society is talking about, what society is putting out, and sort of to avoid all that would be wrong. So like one example, right? Just like loosely, one of the things that I was fine for me to read, fine for me to study. I could even read it on Sabbath, which was great. Was to go back to the quote that you mentioned, was C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia. That was something I read, and I still like those books. But one of the ones that wasn't for a while, and it was until I was like 14 or 15, that I was allowed to interact with, was Lord of the Rings, because that was like too much fantasy, right, and not explicitly Christian enough. Sort of, and I was worried about like Gandalf's a wizard and there's magic there, and the one so that was one that was sort of like I'm not sure if that was ever explicitly sort of said as a no, but it was sort of like one that was like a little bit off to the side. But I mean,
is this coming from your parents or the church or yourself just coming being from concerned or discerning?
Coming from sort of all of them, I would suppose. Like, it's hard to dissect them. But sort of parents and church especially, like more so than parents, I think, for that one. But some others were more explicitly laid down by the parents. But I raised that point, right, because when we look at the story behind both of those stories, right, historically, like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were friends who discussed their faith, and the faith permeated into their work to a certain extent. And what is quite clear, and what many people have noted, is that it's far more subtle in Lord of the Rings in comparison to Chronicles of Narnia, which is like very explicit a metaphor, super overt, whereas Lord of the Rings, it's more like the moral philosophy and the ideas that are undergirding it, and sort of some parallels. And it's been a while since I've read them, so I couldn't point out the specific, but the point is that's sort of something that was seen as a little bit taboo, but was actually sort of Christian to an extent, like in some of the ideas. And I wouldn't call it a Christian film, right? But it's sort of a way that some of the ideas permeate culture in other ways, and I think that's something that's interesting.
Going back to your comments, there was a lot that we could unpack out of that, but it just, that word discernment sort of stands out to me, and as something that we like to get practical on Adventist Record Live. And I guess, speaking of practically, like, to be discerning, what does that look like? I guess I can relate to a lot of what you said about my experience. My mum introduced me to C.S. Lewis and to Lord of the Rings, as well as something that was, some fantasy that I could engage with. But there was a lot of other stuff she was like much more careful with, and would say, maybe don't go into that stuff. As I got older, I guess I got more autonomy, more choice in the matter. As my discernment grew as a person, she felt the ability to give me more space to make my own decisions. But at the same time, like, it was modeling that discernment for me. What do you think? Are there any principles that we should take into that? Or is it, each person to their own? Because I guess, one comment that might challenge some of our listeners, our viewers, is something you said about it challenging us, or the ability to challenge our faith to actually grow. And I think you're right, but that has to be nuanced or contextualized for some people, because that might be a really challenging statement for them. Why should my faith be challenged if it's the truth and it's correct and stuff? But I guess going back to what C.S. Lewis was saying about truth, you can have a greater revelation of it. I think the Apostle Paul said that now I see things through a glass, like darkly or dimly. I see it's sort of blurry, but I get a greater, Jesus will ultimately reveal that, and I'll see it in its full. But I guess C.S. Lewis was sort of explaining how, as we grow through life, we start seeing heavenly things more revealed in some of the things that we engage with, the stories that he was reading and writing. So yeah, I guess discernment. Is it wise, and maybe it's not wise for us to do, but maybe there's some guidelines or pointers if someone's like, how do I make some of these decisions? Is there any principles that you'd take, from media literacy to understanding the content and having discernment in it? Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah. So I do want to start with one of the sort of sub questions you nestled in that question, which is the why should I, challenge myself if I know I have the truth, sort of thing. Which
right,
and I'll tie that back in, but to that I would say, sort of like, firstly, a couple of things, like the absolute certainty that you have the truth is a gift that I think very few people have, like the 100% certainty in the faith, right? And that, like, the Bible is explicit about that, right? Like, it's faith like a mustard seed that does great things. It's a small amount. Like, God does not expect us to have absolute certainty necessarily. And the other thing I would say is that if you do have that absolute certainty, then that's great for you. But if you stay static as a result, you're never going to convince anybody else. You're never going to be able to convince anybody else, because the discussion and the discourse around what is truth will have moved well past you. And anything you say in an attempt to convince anybody else will be horrifically outdated and not applicable to their lives, because your truth is based on sort of the discussions about truth, which were occurring, I don't know, like 5-10 years before, and people have moved past that and they're dealing with different issues and different things. And so when you're trying to appeal to them with your truth, it is, almost like it's in a different reality to them. Now, how we challenge ourselves and the discernment part how we challenge ourselves is where the discernment comes back in. And I think sort of one of the things that has come up with a couple of our discussions here is, what we did and didn't watch and stuff when we were children. And I think that that's one of the important areas where discernment comes in, right? Is understanding and setting boundaries of, like, what children can reasonably understand and engage with. And I think that sometimes parents give a little too little credit to their kids in this regard, but I think also sometimes you see that maybe you're giving them a bit more than they can handle. It varies. That's sort of the reason, right, that ratings exist, right? And ratings are a form of discernment. They're based on secular ideas, right? They're based on just like Australian cultural ideas or American cultural ideas or wherever you might be. But that's why, there are some ratings which are hard lines, R18, restricted, right? They are like, this is content that we as a society think should not be acceptable for anybody over the age of 18. But then content that is PG or M, oftentimes the phrasing there is recommended for, or recommended that you be accompanied, right? Recommended. Like, ratings are a guide for what society
Right.
expects discernment on these sorts of things it would to be. And that's reasonable, because you wouldn't necessarily expect, obviously there's the issues of like what you would want to expose your child to. You wouldn't want to expose them to sort of violence at an age that you think might traumatize them or affect them negatively. But then also, right, there are some of these films and some of these pieces of popular media are engaging with things that are quite interesting on a spiritual level, but
Right.
not in a way that you can easily understand or necessarily grasp if you don't have that media literacy, right? Which is what we're saying is so important. And media literacy is something that comes like with training and learning and understanding of it, but also that is something that comes with age. You can't expect a child to fully grasp the nuances of a complex debate, or the sort of like Socratic dialogue that might be presented in the conversation between two characters in a film. Yeah.
And so people, when they're looking for discernment, they're obviously basing that on their faith. They may not need media training as such, but in terms of their beliefs, they can look at how their beliefs interact with that piece of content, and how it goes for or against. There might be stuff like often I'll engage with pieces of content that I don't necessarily fully agree with, right? I don't necessarily live that lifestyle or even, agree with everything the main character might do. But you touched on this in a bit of a science podcast as well, about the idea of these anti-heroes and villains becoming more popular. The story of, I guess, evil triumphing. And we're not necessarily suggesting that those are good things all the time, but at the same time, some of the exploration of the fall and the brokenness of humanity only reveals God's grace to us more. In some ways, it reveals the positives. You can't see the positives without some of that negative thing. So you might have a movie that has something that you don't agree with living out in your own personal life, but it reveals more about the human condition and about God's grace than perhaps having a complete unrealistic portrayal, I guess, of a squeaky clean situation where everything's perfect.
Yeah. So I have a great example of this. It might be slightly controversial, but one of my favorite shows from last year was a Netflix series called Midnight Mass, which is a horror series about vampires in church, which is, like,
I can't do horror.
Yeah, you see your expression. And I was somebody that was raised, that was one of the things that like mom and dad were very like, oh, there's no merit in horror. And when you think about movies like Saw and whatnot, like, definitely understand where they're coming from. But like this series was at least the vampires are in church, Jesse says. But this series was fascinating for me because yes, it was that, but it was also a fascinating study of how people view the church in present day society and what exactly, they view as the failings are and why people might be leaving the church and what it means to have faith, and, tackling some of those questions of why bad things happen to good people. And it was a really illuminating series in that regard, and it engaged with those issues in a way that I would argue is even better than some of the Christian media that you see, because sometimes you hear like people talking about like Christian media having a low quality, and there's some good stuff out there, but there's also some stuff that just like trots out like very, the stories that we've heard since, Sunday school or Sabbath school sort of thing, in, an adult context, right? But it's telling the same, like, morality that was designed to appeal to you when you were 4, when you're 24.
Right.
And this was something which was actually trying to engage with some of the more thorny issues and about like faith and doubt, which
Right.
was really fascinating because that's something that I think Christian media tends to shy away from sometimes. It's like, oh, we don't want to show room for doubt because that means that people might not believe. But this was like willing to do so.
The flip side of our conversation is that Christian media space where not everything that's branded as Christian media should be swallowed by a discerning viewer, Adventist or otherwise. There's prosperity gospel teachings. Sometimes there's even pagan sort of concepts that are masquerading as Christian, just because it doesn't have swearing or it doesn't have nudity and it's Christian framework. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily good to just it's wholesome, it's hallmark, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily good to just swallow without, again, discernment. I think that's a really key part of our conversation today, is that understanding that, because excuse me, a lot of people are talking about this at the moment, people swallowing things without any analytical tools is why the proliferation of fake news is happening.
Right. Yeah, and that's something that I want to come back to as well. Like that is sort of one of the things is fake news, right? Which isn't fiction media literacy, but is like an important media literacy thing nevertheless, in that, right, it's very easy to read and see and believe in things that we want to see, and that we want to know, and that can confirm and feed into that truth. But like, I think that's a big part of discernment, is understanding that, that news article that we read that seemed great, like, might actually not be true. Might actually, that was The Onion, or that was the Batuta Advocate, or that was just, a site peddling in misinformation from, a bot farm in an Eastern European country. Like that happens all the time, and we need to be aware and understanding of that. And I do also think that ties into discernment in other media, right? In that, like, yes, I've mentioned that there are things that we need to be aware of and understand that, maybe I don't want a part of that. But there are other things sometimes I think there's a problem that we see of, like, it's almost like shadow boxing against an opponent that's not actually there, in that we draw all these lines between different sort of things in the media, and we paint it as like a vast conspiracy of people in Hollywood, the liberal elites are out to corrupt us all and everything, right? And like, it's I think it's very easy to believe that there's the one sort of one cabal behind everything, that it's one thing behind everything, right? And ultimately, right, we can place it all down to one thing, which is fallen nature of man and sin, if we do see sort of things that are genuinely horrible in media. But I think that's not always the case, right? In that, like, yes, we might be able to place it on sin, but the idea that there is actually like one cabal behind it all, and not just fallen people, enacting their nature in what they create, that's also a possibility, and that is sort of what I would argue is more likely true. So I think we need to have discernment in not just what we choose, but how we interpret what we see in the media we consume, which is what I would probably say I'm trying to get at there, of like, just because you see the same symbol in 3 different films and it looks vaguely like the symbol that you've seen in like an ancient article of, worshipping some pagan god or anything, doesn't mean that the people making that film were all in a cabal together worshipping that pagan god secretly off, when they weren't filming. Like, you've got to make sure you're discerning in how you're interpreting those things as well.
And I guess on the flip side of that, I'm thinking in our own experience in the church, and I guess um, sometimes we're much more willing to swallow untruths if they come from, and the Bible warns us about wolves in sheep's clothing, false teachers, that sort of thing. Sometimes if it has a Christian label, or it's a famous, I don't know if there should be such a thing as a famous evangelist, but a famous, well-known evangelist or something, we
Maybe there
will.
shouldn't be, but there is.
There is.
Like,
And so we might swallow that hook, line, and sinker without actually assessing each information piece, or sermon, or dare I say entertainment, worship song, in for what it's worth, for what it actually says about God, for what it actually gives us about our world and our understanding of things. We tend to be very susceptible if we only ever consume, and Christianity is not a consumer experience, right? That's
Yeah.
that's one important thing. So if we only ever consume a very narrow kind of content, not that we should be consuming sermons or worship music, but if we only stay in that direct, small spectrum of things that we're feeding our minds with, we don't necessarily have the tools, I've found, to discern when untruth creeps into that as well.
Mm.
We don't have
And
a
that's
broad perspective.
Yeah. And that is true of anything. That's true of not just faith, but of any sort of type of, ideology or hobby or habit or belief. If you get too deep into something, you lose perspective. There's always that potential, and that is something that I think we need to be very aware of in that regard. Yeah.
We had an interesting comment, and this often comes up in conversations that we have in the church. What would Jesus do? WWJD.
Well, he met people where they were at, right? Like, I think that's one of the most interesting and fascinating, like, appealing parts of Jesus's story to me. He was like, he was one to always go to people, meet them where they were at, and understand what their issues and problems were, and provide empathy for them. There was never any, you got to shape up, you got to like, do check before you get to me. And yeah, he didn't partake in their sin, right? But that doesn't mean that he was like shunning of them because of it or anything anyway. And that, again, I think comes back to the complicated idea here of what actually constitutes a sin with media. Is it a sin to watch media that has violence in it, or is would you say, right? Like, the question that I have on my mind is, I sort of view this media issue as one of those ones that is like one where it's a sin depending on the conscience of the individual. Because would you say to someone who's watched a movie that had violence but also a message which they profoundly related to, that echoed Christ's story, and that's how they came to God and Christ, would you say, oh no, that doesn't work, you came to Christ through a sin, sort of thing, right?
Well,
like,
if we said violence was, if that was our measurement, that might really work for some people and it might help, but we'd have to stop reading the Bible, and we'd have to not watch any kind of Jesus film or crucifixion, scenes. I know that, it may sound strange.
I still haven't watched Passion of the Christ because, like,
okay,
because
it's full on.
So funnily enough, there's a story which is a little bit embarrassing. But one of the I went to a Christian school. So one of the classes we had was Bible, analysis of Bible and stuff. I ended up choosing to do studies of religion in year 11 and 12 because I thought it would be nice to get the perspective of other religions through that as well. But like one of the things that they did in Bible was one of the classes, I can't even remember what it was. It was around Easter time, and the teacher was reading a passage of describing, I think it was The Case for Christ, the book that's like, like the evidence for and against. And it was describing like in detail the effect that the crucifixion would have had on him in like, the muscles and the blood and whatnot and everything. And it was like quite in depth as is necessary for sort of like the forensic analysis that it's doing. But it made me quite nauseated. And I got up to go get a glass of water, to get a drink from my drink bottle. And I took 2 steps and I fainted because like the story there, I think maybe I'd skipped breakfast. And so I was already a little bit, but like I fainted because of the graphic imagery there. And so like, I've never watched Passion of the Christ, and there's something about sort of specific forms of violence that, that the story of the crucifixion sort of embodies that I cannot deal with. I think it's not healthy for me as a person, as illustrated by the fainting.
Right.
So I don't.
I don't think I've seen it all through either. I've seen bits and pieces, excerpts of it, or at some place around Easter where it was being shown and stuff. And so, but yeah, very graphic, very gruesome. But I guess even just reading, as you said, a description of that made you feel that way. The Bible, we often sanitize as Christians, I think, and yet it includes some of the grit and the grime, which only highlights, I think, God's grace more. I know you sort of talked about Jesus, just coming back to Jesus, because that's a good place to come back to. What you said about him meeting people where they were at, I think, he didn't partake in those things, but if he were to be judged by the religious leaders of the day, he was described as a drunkard and a party goer and stuff. So whatever he was doing at those places, he seemed to be having a good time, and he seemed to be lumped in with all the sinners there in that space. And that brings me back to something you said about, I guess, being able to relate to the world. And someone in the comments mentioned, being in the world but not of the world. And I guess there is a space for Christians to redeem the media, to be drawing out the redemptive themes, pointing out the hope and encouragement that comes in some media products. And also, I guess, having conversations with our friends and our neighbors. If we've so cut ourselves off from culture and the society that we're living in that we can't relate or don't even understand what they're talking about when they mention the latest trend or the latest, movie, it doesn't mean we have to watch it, but we can still know roughly what it is and what it's all about, and maybe find out why they like it. What is it about it that makes them get into it? What is it that, well, what does it display in terms of themes? What's the spirit of the age that it's sort of trying to explore? And how can we, in understanding that, share our faith with those people? I think that's part of media literacy as well, just understanding what the trends or what the things that media is talking about so that we can engage with those people.
Right. And so that's a good point to convey the flip side to one of the previous ideas I brought up of like, sometimes not everything you see is a conspiracy, right? In that, like, media can be a great tool to engage with people. And I think media often has stuff that we can see and sort of view as religious themes. Does that mean it's always actually a religious theme or like a religious idea? A lot of people say like the hero's journey is just like Christ's sort of sacrifice and story for us. So any story that has the hero's journey, sort of whether you buy into that sort of monomyth idea, is like representative of Christ, right? And it's like, does that mean that everybody that writes a story that involves the hero's journey is attempting to tell a retelling of like Christ? No. Does that mean that we can't use that as a talking point to discuss like some of the similarities and potentially why this journey might reflect some of those ideas? No, of course we can do that, right? And so it's still like interesting to be able to use sort of those things in that regard.
Sorry,
Yeah.
that came up.
No,
That was
sorry,
a
I'm
long
leaning down
comment.
in my chair a bit.
Over your
It's a good,
face.
yeah, it's a good question.
I think it relates to where we're talking around now, which is why I've put it up here on the screen. Sometimes Adventists take issue with worldly media, but don't have the same discernment when it comes to Christian media. I think we covered that a little bit. But her question, and great to have you watching along, Mary Ellen, the former colleague of ours, the star of the show, who's unfortunately moved on to greener pastures. But we're very glad you're watching with us. Have any thoughts? Do we have any thoughts about how or if we should discern Christian media differently to other media? Should there be a higher standard for
I,
Christian branded media?
well, I think there in certain regards, yeah. You if something is trying to engage with ideas of theology and philosophy, right? Of course, you're going to want to judge that more harshly in terms of how it is explicitly presenting those ideas, because it is explicitly trying to get those ideas across. In the same way that if you have a comedy film that has a bit of action in it in one scene, and the action's kind of bad, you're not gonna dock points because it's not an action film, right? It's the same sort of thing. But like if you were watching like an action film and there was bad action in it, you'd be like, well, the entire reason I'm watching this is bad. Um, in the same way, right? Like if you're watching a film that is meant to be like, hey, the core idea we want to tackle here is like, why do bad things happen to good people, and it's trying to like be a drama with discussion of theology or philosophy behind that idea, and it just doesn't say anything about that idea, or it says something that we've heard 100 times, like, yeah, of course we should. And so it's the same way of like, to go to the idea of like portraying, clergy or the church as like weird or bad, right? Like, what's it trying to say there? Is it getting cheap dunks, or is it using a stereotype of like, oh, church bad, cheap dunk sort of thing? And is that like part of the goal of it? If so, like, yeah, that kind of sucks. But if it's like, hey, maybe we should take a look and see at the like, ways that we sometimes lead to fanaticism in the church, like, because we fall into the traps of believing these people even though they are spreading bad theology, then maybe that, is like, all right, that's not bad because it's showing bad clergy. We should actually like analyze it and understand where it's coming from.
And I think one drawback of not having many Christians in the media space or that engaged in that space is that it can become easy for media to caricature or stereotype Christians. Just noticed a lot of one-dimensional Christian characters. If they're Christian characters in any shows or movies at all, they sort of can be quite shallow or quite they'll be a very judgmental character, or they'll be an abusive priest, or they'll be, very much just down one caricature or stereotype or another, rather
Right.
than
And
having real people who are Christians representing real sort of struggles that they go through. And I guess there's a few shows that are a bit better at doing that than others, but most shows are quite poor at doing that.
and that's true. But I would say, right, like, and there's a danger in sort of taking that and viewing that like, oh, the world doesn't care about portraying us accurately or correctly, because the flip side of that is how many stereotypical depictions of Muslims as terrorists do we have on TV? Like, how many stereotypical depictions of the gay best friend do we have on TV? How many stereotypical depictions do we have of like the loving, submissive housewife on TV, right? Media often deals in
So you're
stereotypes,
saying
and
it's a shortcut, it's a shorthand. They throw
it is,
stereotypes
and
all
that
over the
doesn't mean
place.
it's good. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't like criticize it when it comes up.
But I
But
guess
like, yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm not like I'm not
I
saying
guess I guess
that.
groups that
Yeah.
are gaining traction in society are groups that are growing beyond some of those stereotypes. And
Yeah.
pushing themselves into media spaces, telling stories about their own complexities. And so some of those groups are having some great popularity growth in culture. What I guess, going back to my point, is that if Christians were more engaged, more involved, more present in spaces like that, potentially we could tell deeper, better stories so that we could have some cultural credit, some cultural influence, rather than having none at all. I'm not even sure if that's what we want to do as Christians, to influence culture.
Right.
That's a whole nother topic for another day, probably.
Yeah, exactly. Which is like, maybe a topic that you can do down the line of, not media literacy, but in terms of media depiction, right? If it is groups that are growing past that and making concerted efforts to sort of like appear beyond that are starting to get like more nuanced depictions slowly but surely. But like then the question would be, why is that not happening with Christians? Are we not growing? Are we stagnant? And big
Perhaps,
questions, whole other topic. But like,
perhaps not relevant to the public square anymore, or not relevant to the depiction. Period dramas always have the village priest, the parish pastor, that is a main character in the town, sort of influential in village affairs or whatever, but not so much modern depictions of society and the world. So yeah, look, we're running out of time, Ryan. We do always end on a practical note, a positive note, if we can. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today, and for your questions and your comments. It's been great to interact with you. As we're ending, what's something we can think about? What's something you can leave with us, an encouragement perhaps, that we could get better at engaging with? We've talked about a whole broad range of issues today, in the church, outside the church, in terms of media literacy and just understanding the information that's coming through our ears and our eyeballs. What's something that, as a communicator, as a journalist, as someone who's studying your PhD in this sort of communication area, what's something that we could all do better at?
What? So in terms of media literacy, one of the things that I think would be good, both Christians and non-Christians, right? But that sort of helps engage in this is like, part of understanding media literacy is to understand that media is constructed stories and stuff. And as a result, like when we think about media literacy, right, move beyond like, oh, this didn't make sense in the plot and stuff. When you're having those criticisms, like, I think an interesting thing to ask is like, all right, why didn't that make sense? What might they have been trying to say by making that decision and choosing that decision? And sometimes it's like, yeah, all right, they didn't think of that, and that is a big plot hole. But sometimes it's like, oh, that character didn't call the police because it's telling a story about like how trying to fend for yourself and only for yourself and not supporting on anybody is bad. And so he didn't call the police and things ended up bad for him. And like, oh, all right, so this is a movie with a message about the importance of community. And I can take that message of community and I can take that, into a variety of aspects of my life, right? Sorts of things like that, where just like moving a little bit beyond the superficial and the surface level sort of. And then the other thing I would say as well is just sort of to go back to the idea of like consumerism in media and just consuming media. Like, a good question to ask when you're sitting down to watch something or read something is like, why am I reading this? Why am I watching this? And, sometimes that answer is because I need to blow off steam. And that's fine. But like, if you're asking yourself that when you're watching everything and everything you're doing is like, because I need to blow off steam, because I don't want to think, it's like, all right, is there something else I could be doing that's a bit more productive? Even if it's like watching or reading something that is, like a little bit more like, all right, maybe I'll get some light nonfiction, just like very cruisy, easy to read, just to like try engage my brain and engage my knowledge a bit more, right? Like that never hurts. Yeah. You're muted. You've got yourself muted there.
Sorry.
All good.
You're saying in terms of takeaway, we can if we're spending all of our time in mindless escapism, maybe we need to deal with some of the things that we're escaping from in some ways, so that we're not always looking at ourselves going, why am I always going into some of this to blow off steam? Maybe there's too much steam to be blown. And I guess the other idea you're saying is to try and understand some of the agendas and messages behind it, and perhaps we can take away something good. My mother always used to tell me, Ryan, when I was in a church service, it might be boring to you, and I'm just a kid, right? So she's like, it might be boring, but try and find something to take away. Try and find something that can enhance your life or help you this week. So I'm going to leave that with our viewers. Try and take something out of this conversation and other media that you encounter. Try and find something positive that you can take with you during the week. And yeah, we hope you've been blessed by today's conversation. Thanks for joining us, and we'll hopefully catch you next week. Ryan is doing some teaching at uni soon, so he won't be working for us quite as often, but we still hope that he will be writing for Signs and for Record in the future. So thanks for joining us today, Ryan, and thanks for all your hard work over the last year or so. And yeah, we'll see you all next week.
Yeah, thanks for having me.